And so our two panelists today are Leah Nelson and Dana Sweeny. Leah Nelson serves as the research director at Alabama Appleseed, where she uses stories, data, and information to create white papers, written advocacy materials to support Appleseed's campaigns. Prior to joining Alabama Appleseed, Leah spent 5 years in the Capital Habeas Unit of the Middle District of Alabama's Federal Defenders, and before that, she worked as a research and writing fellow at the Southern Poverty Law Center. She covered white supremacy, nativism, and the Patriot Movement, and other forms of extremism for SPLC's Intelligence Project. Leah is a graduate of the University of Connecticut and the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Dana Sweeny is a statewide organizer for Alabama Appleseed, where his work focuses on the crisis of predatory lending in Alabama. Prior to joining Alabama Appleseed, he worked as a Vote Everywhere ambassador for the Andrew Goodman Foundation. Dana previously served as the co-founder and director of the Outlet Literacy Initiative, a creative writing and poetry performance group for high school students in Western Central Alabama. He is a Blackburn Fellow and 2017 graduate of the University of Alabama with a BA in English.
Incredible. Thank you so much for that introduction, Brady, and good afternoon. And thank you to all of y'all who have joined. I see we have 45 people in the room with us, which is incredible. It's a little strange to just see Leah and I's little faces down at the bottom, but I'm glad that you're all joining us. And yeah, today we are here to talk about existing opportunities for community-based alternatives to prison in Alabama. And specifically, as you can see in the subtitle there, how the promise of diversion programs clashes with poverty, addiction, and racism in Alabama. So we're going to try to cover a lot of ground. This can be a little bit of a wonky subject area, but we're going to try to break it down for you and share everything that we've learned in our research, and then hopefully have plenty of time for conversation and questions at the end. So now I'm going to be kind of toggling back and forth here. So let's see. Okay. So I'm going to begin by telling y'all a little bit about who we are at Alabama Appleseed. We are a very tiny nonprofit based in Montgomery with a mighty staff of 5 people. And I am happy to report that 40% of our staff are Blackburn Fellows, because our policy director is Akeisha Anderson, who is also my president of the Fellows Involvement Network. And we work on a variety of issues at the intersection of 2 truths about Alabama. So the first of those truths is that Alabama is the 5th poorest state in America. And the second is that Alabama has some of the most brutal criminal punishment laws, structures, systems in the country as well. So where those 2 things crash together, we get an intersection with lots of issues. And so what we do is lots of very in-depth, original investigative research and reporting. Leah is in charge of a lot of that, and I help out as well. And based on what we find in our research, we craft recommendations for how the legislature should change laws to make Alabama better. And then we also travel all over the state, organizing in communities, talking to people about what we're learning, getting people to the State House, getting people to bother their legislators to try to make Alabama a better state. So that is sort of the contours of what we do and the model of what we do. And now I'm going to shift. I have to change my screen every time I change slides, so please excuse the rough transitions. Now I'm gonna chat about the outline of what we're going to talk about today and sort of give you a little bit more information about what we're discussing. So I'm going to just imagine that there is a pretty broad range of familiarity with these kinds of programs in the room with us today. So to start out with just a very basic definition, we're here to talk about diversion programs in Alabama. So diversion programs are very literally named. They divert people away from incarceration. So if you can imagine, there is a conveyor belt in Alabama, and you are arrested and charged with something, you get on this conveyor belt, you move through prosecution, and at the end of the conveyor belt is prison. Diversion programs exist in varying ways at various stages of that conveyor belt to get you off of it. So there are programs that you can participate in that you are still in a rigorous sort of supervision, but you are not incarcerated in one of Alabama's prisons. And so those programs, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of them, are what we're here to talk about today. And we're going to start with a little bit of context about mass incarceration in prisons in Alabama, because that is sort of the foreground for this conversation. Then we're going to be talking about the web of diversion programs that exist across the state. We'll be talking about Appleseed's research into how those programs work, how they serve people and how they don't serve people properly. We'll go through a couple stories that give a real sort of like human impact experience of what these programs look like in people's lives in Alabama. And then finally, we will talk about recommendations that came out of our research and further visions for how we might be able to address some of the underlying problems and harms that these programs are designed to ostensibly cover. So let's start by talking about mass incarceration in the United States. I believe a lot of this will be fairly familiar to many of y'all in the room, but just as kind of an outline, it's important to establish. So the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world, and it is not a close contest. So the standard metric by which incarceration is measured is how many people are incarcerated per 100,000 people in the population. So the United States incarcerates 698 people per 100,000. The next highest level of incarceration is El Salvador at 618 people per 100,000. And I've listed several other examples there if you can sort of like lean in and squint about other kinds of rates of incarceration. We see that many other countries are far, far below what the United States has, including countries like Canada with 114, France with 104, Sweden with 59 people per 100,000. And what we know is that in the United States, racism is foundational to the carceral system. Every single data point you look at any point along the way, the racism is just self-evident. It is manifestly apparent the way that this system works in racially discriminatory ways. So nationally, looking at the big picture, we see that 67% of all people who are incarcerated in the United States are people of color. People of color comprise, by comparison, 37% of the overall population of the United States. And looking at the solid numbers, we see that 2.2 million people are currently incarcerated in the United States. And this is not only globally unique, but is something that has really exploded over recent decades. It represents a 500% increase in incarceration in the United States over the last 40 years. And a lot of that has to do with the kinds of policies that I'm sure many of you have heard about and are familiar with, things like the drug wars, things like mandatory minimums, harsher sentencing laws that came through the 90s, beginning back in the 80s. It has produced this system of mass incarceration that we are grappling with today, and that very much exists in Alabama. So in Alabama, to zoom in a little bit, we are in the middle of an unprecedented prison crisis. So 2 times in the last 18 months, the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division investigated Alabama's prison system for men and twice declared the entire system to be unconstitutional under the 8th Amendment. So for any of you who are not constitutional scholars in the room, the 8th Amendment is your constitutional protection against cruel and unusual punishment. So both of the investigations that the Department of Justice did were looking at conditions in the prison, looking at use of force on people who are incarcerated in the prison, and found unequivocally in both of those investigations that conditions are so bad in Alabama's prisons that every minute of every day that a person is incarcerated inside of them is a violation of that person's civil rights. To dig into some of what the Department of Justice found, something that people in Alabama have known for a long time, two of the main findings are that Alabama's prisons are overcrowded and understaffed. So currently, system-wide, our prisons are filled to more than 170% of their designed occupational capacity. And that is system-wide. Individual prisons in the Alabama prison system are over 300% of their designed occupancy, leading to conditions that are so bad that there's actually a large homelessness issue among people who are in prison because there are not enough beds to accommodate the number of people that Alabama has put in our prisons. At the same time that we have this incredibly astronomical rate of incarceration, staffing is incredibly low. So for years, staffing in Alabama's prisons has hovered around 30% of the staffing level that would be required to do the bare minimum of ensuring the bare physical safety of people who are incarcerated in Alabama. And that's not a number that we have seen budge in many years, despite lots of litigation. We know there are other problems as well inside of prisons that deteriorate conditions. So we know that Alabama's prisons have the highest homicide rate of any prison system in the country. According to the DOJ's investigation, it's estimated that between 50 to 90% of people who are in Alabama's prisons have substance addiction issues because drugs are so rampant inside of the prison system, are much more readily available inside of prisons than outside of prisons, largely because they are smuggled in by corrections officers. And we also see that most people in Alabama's prisons are expected to be armed, many for their own safety, because as people arrive in prisons in Alabama, corrections officers will often tell them that they can't guarantee their safety. And finally, looking at the composition of who is incarcerated in Alabama's prisons, it reflects what we see nationally and what we know historically to be true. So there are incredible racist disparities in terms of Alabama's prison population. Again, returning to that metric of how many people per 100,000 are incarcerated, we see that white people in Alabama are incarcerated at a very high rate of 525 people per 100,000. But we see that Black people in Alabama are incarcerated at more than 3 times that rate, 1,788 people per 100,000, which is globally unheard of. What is happening in Alabama in terms of incarceration is globally unique and significant. And then at the bottom of that reporting, we also see that Hispanic Alabamians are incarcerated at much higher rates as well, 767 people per 100,000. So Alabama is in the middle of this, truly appalling prison crisis at this very moment. And as part of the framing for this conversation, we also, need to understand and make clear that it's not just prison. Prison is the end point of this conveyor belt. And as we're talking about diversion programs, we're talking about the entire conveyor belt. And we're able to see racism at each step of that as well. So just a couple examples of, how particularly Black people in Alabama are over-policed, are overcharged, over-sentenced in ways that we have seen shown up in our research. In just our own research at Appleseed, we found that Black Alabamians are more than 4 times as likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than white people in Alabama, despite the same rates of possession. And in certain jurisdictions, notably Huntsville, we see that disparity increases to more than 12 times. We have seen that more than half of all people in Alabama, 54% who are incarcerated, are Black, compared to a statewide population that is 27% Black. And finally, we have data from 2016 about the top 20 offenses for which people were arrested. And we see that for 6 of those top 20 charges, Black people were at least 2 times as likely to be arrested. And many of those top 20 offenses are what we would describe as subjective charges, where the perception of the arresting officer has a lot to do with whether the charge is brought. So an example of that would be resisting arrest, which has defined standards, but is definitely in a sort of subjective zone. And I appreciate Leah just dropped in the box there, a shout out to another Blackburn fellow, Will Tucker, at the Southern Poverty Law Center, who has partnered with us on a lot of this research. So knowing all of that, seeing that Alabama is in the middle of an unprecedented prison crisis, seeing that there's racism from top to bottom of this system, we know that the state is in a moment of flux. So I'll give you a little bit of the current landscape, and then in a moment I'm going to turn it over to Leah. But what's happening right now, in light of the Department of Justice twice declaring Alabama's entire prison system to be unconstitutional, is that Governor Kay Ivey is currently moving forward with a plan that would spend $2.6 billion of Alabama taxpayer dollars to contract private prison companies to build 3 new mega prisons, would effectively double the size of Alabama's prison system as it currently exists. And those prisons would be built under a 30-year lease system. It would be the largest prison expansion project in a very long time in the nation. And for what it's worth, the private prison industry has actually been struggling over the last 4 years and has lost a lot of contracts and access to credit. Lots of major banks have been successfully pressured into no longer extending loans to the industry. So this prison construction, this multi-billion-dollar prison construction plan in Alabama is actually really considered to be a lifeline to the private prison industry. So what is happening here is of tremendous national significance. At the same time, there's been a lot of pressure, certainly Appleseed. We have been doing everything we can to try to stop that prison construction plan from happening. But the question then becomes, well, what is the alternative to address this crisis? There are lots of things that we recommend. We talk about modernizing our drug policy. We talk about changing sentencing laws. But one of the things that consistently has come up at the State House is the interest in expanding diversion programs. Again, recognizing that our prisons are over 170% over their designed capacity, a lot of conversation about, well, we have these ways to get people off of that conveyor belt into these other programs. We should be doing that. Unfortunately, prior to our research on this topic, there was really no data available by anyone about how these programs were working or not working, the efficacy of these programs. And so that's where we sort of stepped in, because our view is absolutely that the more sensible, the more humane, even the more economical approach to the prison crisis would be to decarcerate, to incarcerate fewer people. Because again, what we're doing in Alabama is globally unusual. We don't have so many people in prison because Alabamians are like the most dangerous people in the world. We have so many people in prison because we have bad laws, and we could be changing those. But to the extent that this conversation is happening about expanding diversion programs, it is very important to know what they are and how they're working. And so for that, I am now going to turn y'all over to Leah to talk about those programs.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. So before I get started, I want to expand a little on where Dana left off, because I wanted to be clear. The best way to reduce excessive punishment in Alabama and to fix our prison crisis is to fix our law crisis. We have very, very harsh laws here. We have drug policy that dates back to the war on drugs and is pretty far out of step with the rest of the state, with the rest of the country. Possession of any amount of marijuana can be a felony the first time you possess it, and it's always a felony. The second time, possession of any amount of any controlled substance is automatically a felony. So we have very, very, very harsh laws, and that's why we have so many people in prison. And although I'm about to talk about diversion programs and what we learned about them and how we can make them better, I want to be clear that I wouldn't endorse any of these programs. They're all pretty deeply problematic, but at the same time, thousands and thousands of people in Alabama are spending time in these programs. And I believe that the recommendations that we're able to offer would make them meaningfully better for the people that participate in them. So this is sort of a harm reduction conversation that should not take the place of a more serious reckoning with why we have so many people who end up arrested and charged with crimes, and whether it makes sense for our criminal code to exist as it does. And that's work that Appleseed does too on drug policy and sentencing. But right now we're talking about diversion, which is a really important conversation because it impacts the lives of so many people. So what's diversion? There's a bunch of different kinds, but they boil down to two categories. The first kind is pre-adjudication programs. Basically, you've been arrested, you've been charged with a crime, you have not been convicted of that crime yet. And if you complete these pre-adjudication programs successfully, then you get to go on with your life and you don't have a criminal history. Post-adjudication programs happen after you have already been found guilty, but they are ways that you can serve your sentence in the community. So for pre-adjudication programs, the one you're probably most familiar with is drug court. There are other types of treatment courts for veterans and mental health issues and first-time possessors of guns who aren't supposed to have them. There are also diversion programs that are run by district attorneys' offices. And for post-adjudication, there's something called court referral, which usually relates to drug crimes. And there's community corrections, which is a lot like probation, but with more programming and more check-ins. So all of these programs do not exist everywhere in the state, but there is some type of diversion program everywhere in the state. It's a little bit of a patchwork mishmash depending on where you are. Next slide, please, Dana. Sorry. All right, so how did we learn about them? We surveyed people. We surveyed nearly 600 people who were currently or had been involved in diversion programs, and we asked them, how did this affect your life? How much did it cost? How much time did you spend? Were you able to successfully complete the program? And if not, why not? And we interviewed dozens of them to get a deeper picture of how their lives had been impacted by diversion and what their experience had been. We also traveled around the state and observed several drug courts and were granted really unprecedented sort of all access backstage passes to the deliberation that happens among the judges and the drug court staff, which is very thorough, where they look at each case individually and try and determine what's best for that person and how that person can succeed. We also submitted dozens of records requests to the Administrative Office of Courts and various individual courts and other entities that we thought would have data on who is in these programs. And what we learned from those requests is that that information is not routinely tracked. The state does not know how many people are in diversion programs, who they are demographically, what kind of crimes they've been accused or convicted of, how long it takes them to complete the programs, how much the programs cost, what kind of things they're having to do to complete the programs, whether they reoffend again afterwards. I mean, it is the amount of information that there is not is really overwhelming. Our report is the first look at how these programs work. Next slide, please. So I'm going to let Dana take this one. Our findings just quickly are kind of in two categories. One was about the financial impact of diversion programs and the other about structural obstacles that prevent them from working the way that they were intended. Dana, take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. So to talk about how these programs are costly, you know, I I can share that as we went into this process with no data existing anywhere else or being available anywhere else, as Leah described, one of the hunches that I had, I thought these programs were going to be filled with more affluent Alabamians who would be able to afford them. That was kind of my running assumption, and that was disproven by what we found when we started surveying hundreds of people who are participating in the programs. What we found was that most of the people who are participating in these programs are poor. So we found that 55% of all of the people we spoke to who were participating in these programs reported making less than $15,000 a year in income. And we also found that the median cost of participating in these programs is about $1,600, which, again, to put in perspective against the median income reported, that's more than 10% of that $15,000 a year that we found. And I just, to like really paint how stark that is, do remember that like these programs, all of the people who are participating in these programs are on that conveyor belt that we've been talking about. And so what is being offered to people is, you know, very often you can go to one of Alabama's deadly, violent, unconstitutional prisons, or you can spend more than 10% of your annual income to participate in one of these programs in order to retain your liberty. So it leads to many, many dire choices on the parts of participants. We found that 1 in 5 people who might have been eligible for diversion programs were turned away up front because the court decided that they were not wealthy enough, they did not have enough money to be deemed a likely successful participant. So those people just kept on the conveyor belt. They weren't given the option. We found that among those who passed the initial screening, 1 in 5 again were either kicked out or had to drop out because they couldn't keep up with payments. And again, we're back on that conveyor belt towards incarceration and conviction. And we also found that nearly half of all respondents, half of the people that we spoke to in these programs had to turn to payday or title loans in order to afford their participation and to be able to afford their liberty. And this is an issue that I care a lot about, but for those who aren't familiar, these are storefront lenders in Alabama who charge incredibly high APRs, annual percentage rates, which you can kind of think of as an interest rate. So title loans in Alabama run up to 300% APR, and payday loans run up to 456% APR. That's the kind of interest that people are paying on these loans to try to keep themselves from going to prison, to try to keep up with these programs. So the sort of financial toll that these programs take on people is really hard to describe. There's so many consequences that come out of the inaccessibility of these programs financially. Leah, do you want to talk about some of the structural concerns?
Yeah, and I will say, like Dana, I came into this research with a lot of hypotheses, including that it would mostly be wealthy people, and also mostly focused on the financial consequences, because that's what a lot of my work has generally been about previously, is like how costly it is to be caught up in the criminal justice system. But what we found when we started looking at these courts and programs is that absolutely, financial barriers are a huge, huge problem, but it's not just that. An even bigger problem, and one that's more difficult to figure out a straightforward solution to, is the fact that diversion programs are not set up to meet people where they are. So the people who are in these programs, in addition to being poor, have complicated lives, just like everybody, but often slightly more complicated because poverty complicates everything. So a lot of these people work in retail jobs without regular hours. They're, they may not have a boss that they can easily negotiate with if they have to go to court or deal with the various like time consequences of these courts. Many of them have young children. Some of them are single parents. Some of them are caring for older relatives. They have complicated multi-generational family structures. And Also, a lot of them lack driver's licenses. Alabama takes people's driver's license away for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with dangerous driving. Unpaid traffic debt, failing to appear at a hearing to explain why you're not paying the traffic debt, certain drug convictions. All of those things can lead to your driver's license being suspended, and that makes it really, really hard to get where you need to go. And at the same time, these diversion programs are extremely demanding on people's time, and they're set up in a way that assumes people have transportation and that they can get to court a lot. So we sat in on dockets. That would be like the day that everybody comes to check in and let the judge know how they're doing. And around the state, those docket days take about 4 hours each. And most of it's just kind of sitting and waiting for your name to be called. And then you go up and have a little conversation with the judge and let the judge know how you're doing. And then you leave. But people are there for about 4 hours at a time. In most drug courts, you'd have to do that at least once a month. And in many places, multiple times a month, kind of depending on how closely you're being monitored and how well you've complied with the terms of the drug court or diversion program. And on top of that, you also have to go and give urine samples whenever the state wants you to. And you find out about those. You have about 12 hours to go and do this, give the sample from when you find out, but often less because the places that take the samples are only open during business hours in many places. So the upshot is that diversion programs can become almost like a full-time job between those docket days and driving to go and give urine samples. They pick up a lot of time. And we found that 1/5 of our respondents had to turn down diversion opportunities because of childcare or work or school obligations. And about the same number had to drop out for those same reasons. And what's really nauseating about that is that dropping out of a diversion program, especially one of those pre-adjudication programs, puts you back on the conveyor belt to a conviction and often to prison. And what we learned actually is that if you start a program and you drop out, you will have a harsher outcome very often than if you had not entered the program, but instead like negotiated a plea deal. So people who fail for structural reasons end up in worse shape than people who never entered the programs. And very often those structural or financial failures have nothing to do with the person's like willingness or desire to be compliant with the program's terms. As I said, driver's licenses are a huge problem. If you don't have a driver's license, you have to find a ride to court who's willing to either stay there with you for 4 hours or come and go and get you. And that is even more complicated because these programs aren't portable. So to make this concrete, you all normally live in Tuscaloosa when we're not all sheltering in place due to a pandemic, or maybe you're in Tuscaloosa now. If you were caught with some marijuana in Shelby County, you would have to do drug court in Shelby County. So I think it's about an 1.5-hour drive from Tuscaloosa to Columbiana where the court is. You'd be expected to go there a couple times a month for one of those docket days. And then any time they wanted to test your urine, which can be up to 28 times a month, you'd have to drive from Tuscaloosa to Columbiana and back, be strip searched, pee in a cup, wait for the results, and then drive back to Tuscaloosa. That is an unbelievable time commitment. It would be very hard for a student to navigate, and it's almost impossible for someone who's working or caring for a child to do. So that's what we mean by structural obstacles, and the recommendations that we have in addition to funding have very much to do with trying to mitigate some of the worst structural obstacles that we found. Next slide. All right, so I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of people that we talked with. The first one is a guy named Ryan, who we heard about when we were sitting in on a drug court meeting in Shelby County. So this is a young father. He had an addiction issue. he had gotten in trouble in Chilton County, which was where he lived, and he was on probation in connection with drug possession. And then he was caught again with drugs in Shelby County. And Shelby County said, you know what, we'll give you a chance, participate in our drug court, and you won't get a conviction. And that's what he decided to do. Shelby County's drug court, they are proud to admit and acknowledge and brag that it is pretty much the toughest one in the state, but he was doing really well. He was complying. He was successful in rehab. He was a leader in his class when he did inpatient rehab. He got out. He got a job. He got a car, and he went to register the car and found out that there was a warrant for his arrest because he had not been showing up to his probation officer in Chilton County. He thought that all of the requirements of Shelby County meant that his probation had been rolled all into one big package in Shelby County, and that was who he was responsible to now. But it turns out, no. He was also supposed to be checking in Chilton County. And the only way for him to resolve that was to turn himself in and sit in jail for 3 months, which he did from May to July of last year until a judge said he was free to go. But during those 3 months, everything fell apart again, and he basically had to start again from the beginning. And when I spoke with him, Ryan was paying almost half his monthly income towards various fines and fees and legal financial obligations that had to do with diversion, probation, and his conviction. And then we have another woman named Amber, who I met in Madison County. She was one of these people who was in a post-conviction program. She was in community corrections. And she was granted that opportunity after spending some time in Tutwiler, which is Alabama's prison for women. And she was so excited because she had 2 teenage sons, and her mother, who's disabled, was caring for them. And her boys were really struggling. The younger one just really was not handling having his mother away and in prison. He was failing in school, and she was so glad to be home with him. And she had gotten all of these certifications at Tutwiler. She, had learned Spanish. She had gotten a communications certification. She knew how to operate a forklift. She was ready to work. So she was sure she'd be able to pay whatever fees came up. And when she got out, they were within 24 hours, you need to show up with $290 to pay for an ankle monitor. She was able to find that money, and she was able to get a whole bunch of jobs, but every time she would show up for the first day of work at a warehouse or at a big box store, and they would say, oh, you know what? Your criminal history just came back. We don't want you. And she'd go home. When I talked with her last, she was afraid she was going to end up back in Tutwiler in state custody away from her boys in prison again because she could not afford the costs of paying for her liberty. And then there's Marilyn. Marilyn was arrested in 2013 at a Dave Matthews concert in Columbiana. Or in Shelby County, sorry. And she was offered drug court. And Marilyn, unlike Ryan and Amber, had a pretty stable job and a stable life and an understanding boss and family that was able to support her. But even so, and even she was able to succeed and kind of take the fast track through drug court. But the fast track was 9 months. During that time, she couldn't go to any out-of-state functions in case she had to rush to Columbiana to go pee in a cup. And she had to deal with a dental surgery problem. She couldn't have surgery during that time that was needed because they don't let you use prescription pain medication. So even if you need to have a root canal and you need Vicodin or whatever to manage that, and even if you don't have a drug problem, which Marilyn didn't, she just was a recreational pot smoker, she was not able to have needed dental surgery in order to comply with the terms of the court. As she said to me, I eventually got out of it. I paid enough money, and then she moved out of state. So even for people who succeed in these programs, they are traumatic and disruptive, and for her, unnecessary. She didn't need treatment. We just need to change our drug laws. Next slide, Dana. All right, so I'm going to let Dana take the top line recommendations.
Yeah, as I think you all probably can tell from the information we've shared about our research, this is certainly not our infomercial for diversion programs in Alabama. We know that they are deeply, deeply flawed, that they are causing all kinds of new harms because of the way that they're structured. And so, our longer term interest is seeing addiction and mental health issues and many of these other low-lying offenses treated as public health issues, because that is the rational and humane way to address those issues. That would look like funding social services, addiction treatment, mental health services. So those are longer range things that Appleseed works on and is interested in. And we also know, as Leah mentioned earlier, that as conversations are happening at the State House about expanding these programs in light of the prison crisis, and as thousands of people are currently sentenced to participate in them, there are things that could be changed this year at the State House that would make these programs more manageable and more survivable for people who are moving through them to, again, get off of that conveyor belt so that they don't end up in Alabama's prisons. So we have some specific recommendations that I'm going to turn over to Leah.
Okay. So I won't get too detailed about these because I think they're pretty obvious based on our non-infomercial for diversion programs. Number one, we need to fully fund these. It can't be that poverty is the difference between a conviction and a prison sentence or being able to slog your way through one of these extremely difficult, costly programs. It's interesting because the state will say, well, they don't discriminate against indigent people. They let anybody into these programs, and that's true, but they don't accommodate their poverty. So that means that a lot of people are functionally unable to complete them for financial reasons. And then structurally, the programs need to do more to meet people where they are. There is not a perfect way to do that. There will still be some people who are shut out of these programs for structural reasons, but at the very least, these programs could operate on much longer hours so that people are not having to miss, only appear between 9 and 5. They could make court appearances much shorter, and they could make the programs portable. That's a little bit complicated, but it could be that if you offend in Shelby County but live in Gadsden, that you serve your sentence in Gadsden. If the state decided to make these programs uniform and just develop a system so that you serve your sentence where you live instead of serving your sentence where you offended, that would greatly reduce the imposition on people. And then, of course, as I said, driver's licenses. If we stop taking people's driver's licenses away at the drop of a hat, then it would be a lot easier for people to do all sorts of things, including participate in diversion programs. And then more of a moonshot, but really cannot be said enough. We need to modernize our drug policy so that not so many people end up in diversion to begin with. So I think that pretty much wraps up our presentation, except for what you can do now if you care about this. Yeah. We can't hear you, dude. Oh.
Thank you, Leah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm glad that the power did not go out or something. Yeah, so if you are interested in any of the range of topics that we've touched on today that are, again, at that intersection of Alabama being one of the poorest states and also having some of the most brutal criminal punishment laws, one way that you can keep up is to join our action alerts list, which I am dropping in the chat right now. If you sign up there, we can add you to, again, our action alerts list. We are too small of an organization to spam you, but as things are happening at the State House, we can share updates with you. We can make it easy for you to take action, contact your legislators. You don't even need to know who they are. We have a digital platform where it's automated so that we can just help you plug right in. But again, you also don't need us to facilitate that. If you are very passionate about these issues, These are things that lawmakers are talking about at the State House in Montgomery. So feel free to call them up, invite them to coffee, send them an email, because they like to talk about these things, and it would be good to develop that kind of relationship with your lawmakers. And then finally, you could also just keep up with us on our Facebook or Twitter to keep abreast of developments. And my last plug will also be that if you go on our website, which is alabamaappleseed.org, you can find both our full reports on all of the issues that we've done. All of the things that we've published are available to scroll through and read through. We've also got it broken down into kind of like major highlights of each of our investigative reports. So there's lots of additional information there. But at this point, I see we have about 15 minutes left, and we can turn it over to our moderator, I think, for maybe facilitating some questions.
Yes, and actually, I'm pretty sure this session goes until 4:15.
Oh, sweet.
If you want to take a little longer, you can, or we can start with some questions.
Now let's turn it into a conversation. I see there's already good questions, and it's certainly a large topic. So,
okay, I'm just going to start with the first question I see. And actually, before we get started, if any of y'all want to ask your person, you can just ask to share your audio and video, and I can let y'all in one at a time, and you can just directly say ask our panelists. But Lauren Chambliss is asking, how are Alabama Appleseed's recommendations received among public officials in Alabama?
it depends on the official. It's really complicated. I think that, we have two layers of recommendations, but fundamentally they both cost money. And we have a funding problem in the state. I mean, we have, as you probably know, consistently not enough money. And so these are user-funded programs right now. I think there's an understanding when we've talked about this with lawmakers from both parties that things as they are, that the status quo is not working. But not necessarily a complete understanding of why it's not working. That it's not just about money, it's also about these structural issues, which themselves go back to money in many ways. I feel like we have a lot more education to do. Because right now people hear us when we say it's not working, but the solutions that the state is able to come up with quickly are not adequate. It was kind of exciting last session, though, to see that both houses were pushing bills that would have created kind of a study commission to really look at how these programs are working and how they could work better. I think that that is an essential intermediate step because there's just so much information missing. And we will be pushing to make sure that to the extent that a study commission is formed, that it actually hears from people like the folks that we talked with directly. So that it's not just lawyers and policymakers talking with each other, but actually is informed by the user experience of these programs.
And I think I would also just jump to chime in. I'll also note, I see Catherine posted that the session will be ending in just a couple minutes. So I will try to address a second question I saw in the chat, which was David Zell's question. Given the relationship between capitalism and the carceral state, the fact that these are user-funded programs, municipalities can sometimes profit on these. How can we persuade lawmakers or municipalities, et cetera, to take steps that are contrary to their own interests? I think that's a great question, and it's something that we're thinking about all the time. And to sort of tag on to what Leah said, one of the things that we run into at the State House is that a lot of our recommendations require state funding. Money, like funding these programs. And so we often are having to do a little bit of this two-step and in a position to say, like, we are here for the humanitarian violations that are occurring all the time in Alabama. That is what brings us into this work. And we also have lots of supporting research and evidence to show that, like, incarcerating people in Alabama is insanely expensive. And to the extent that Alabama does not have a lot of tax revenue, does not have that much money in its budget, that's an argument that we make is, right, like what you are doing currently is not only inhumane and violating people's civil rights, but also is nonsensically expensive, and trying to make inroads with those kinds of arguments as well, which sometimes do get us traction when we're able to demonstrate the ineffectiveness of the investments that the state is currently making compared to investments that they could be making.
Okay, I am waiting on a message back from Catherine just to make sure we're not ending at 3:50. So we can try to answer another question real quick if we want.
I'm really interested in David Zell's question, if I may, because that is one of the hardest questions. So David asks, basically, given that so many municipalities fund themselves on fines and fees and income from criminal justice laws, I think that's what you mean by CJS. How do you persuade them to take steps that are against their own interests? That is like the big project that Appleseed and so many other organizations are engaged in. And I think the project is explaining that, first of all, they're not collecting that money. So we've done other research, and I would encourage folks to go on Appleseed's website and look at our Under Pressure report. And you'd see that a lot of people aren't paying what they owe. So it's kind of, it's hypothetical income, not real income that they'd be foregoing if they stopped charging money for some of these things. But also, it's very hard for people to prosper when they can't ever save money, when all intergenerational wealth is bled into the criminal justice system. Then people can't invest in their families, invest in themselves and their children. They can't do the things that you need to do to kind of climb the ladder of prosperity in America. So yes, if things were less expensive, if fines and fees were not so onerous, there would be some reduction in income to municipalities and to the state, which frankly is funded and very much based on fines and fees. Fines and fees that are collected by the courts go and are spent on any number of things that you would not expect them to be spent on. Not just keeping the courts alive, but education. The American Village at Montevallo gets $1 from every court filing. So just, we need to rethink how we fund the state and what we think that success looks like. If success looks like the state continuing to collect money from poor people, then it would be against the state's interest to restructure things. But if success looks like people having the money that they need to live healthy lives, then it would be in the state's interest to stop doing things the way that it's doing them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and the only other thing that I'll reference as well, that might be obvious, but maybe just bears saying is, this conversation is also in the context when we think about the composition of the state legislature. By a very wide margin, we're talking about a very conservative supermajority of legislators. And so in order for any laws to change, we have to be able to build those kinds of coalitions. So that's a very important question that you asked, David. But yeah, we can, Brad, do you want to choose another question?
Yes. Okay, so Maddie Lewis just asked, can you speak to the relationship between overcrowding in Alabama's prisons and abuses of human rights related specifically to coronavirus exposure? And then is there even any information or research available on this topic thus far?
Yeah, I can jump in at a very, 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 very important question. So at the beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak, the Alabama Department of Corrections, ADOC, was very much in a stick our heads in the sand position. We're not responding to any concerns about COVID-19. In fact, one of the things that we were frantically working on at the beginning of the crisis was that ADOC was not providing people in Alabama's prisons with soap or with hand sanitizer in very, very crowded dorms. And so, because the state wasn't even providing soap, advocates around the state had to do a statewide soap drive to try to get sanitation products to people in prison. So if that tells you anything about kind of like their approach at the outset, it has been, my personal view, homicidally negligent. So since then, for months into the pandemic, the prisons currently hold about 23,000 Alabamians. And I think we were already in May, and I think they had conducted just like a few dozen COVID tests, even though like dozens and dozens of staffers of corrections officers had tested positive, even though there were widespread reports that we were getting from people in the prisons of entire dorms that were coming down. Testing was almost non-existent in the prisons. And to date, because the number keeps changing, I actually don't have it right now. Dozens of people who are incarcerated have died from COVID-19 in Alabama alone. We actually have a report, a sort of mini report that it's not published yet, but it's something that we've been working on, just tracking deaths of people who are in ADOC custody. And I'll just also note, we don't have because the reporting is so bad from ADOC, we don't have a lot of information about what's happening beyond what we're hearing from people inside. But I think that we're likely going to see, because of the racist disparities in terms of who is incarcerated, because of racist disparities in deaths across other issues, homicides, suicides in Alabama's prisons, I think we're going to see that reflected in COVID-19 deaths as well.
Yeah, and it's not even just the specific deadly consequences of COVID-19 are one thing, but the other thing that's happening in prisons is that all programming is shut down. So usually prisoners kind of get by. Their lifeline is at least a minister comes in every once in a while, and they pray together, they have some kind of activities together. At least there's some kind of educational programming, and much of which would come into the prison and then leave. And then for people that are in work release, at least they get to leave and go to a job. And it's not that it's a pleasant job, but at least they have that. And all of that is also on hold during COVID. So in addition to the immediate fear and sickness and death caused specifically directly by the virus, there's also thousands and thousands of people in warehouses that were already deadly because of the tension and denial of basic need services in them, they're just waiting. Nothing is happening. There's no programming going on. And especially in some of the places that are designed for people not to stay in all the time, like work release centers, have even less programming because typically you leave during the day. So now we just have people hanging out, waiting, and terrified. So you can imagine that it's not just the virus that's the problem, it's the shutdown as well.
And just as one other note that I would add, that's not necessarily COVID-19 specific or related, but just as we've been going through the summer, it is worth mentioning as well that most ADOC facilities are not air conditioned. So as we've been going through the hot summer, we have had tens of thousands of Alabamians warehoused into overcrowded rooms with no air conditioning while a pandemic is spreading, and not being given soap. The conditions are just unbelievable. So
yeah.
I'm not sure if this question has been answered yet, but Mackenzie Barrett is asking, does Alabama Appleseed have a position concerning prison education programs in Alabama? And then especially those could potentially serve as community-based alternatives, especially those which could probably, sorry.
I don't think we have a position on them. I mean, I guess what I would say generally is it is better for prisons to have programming than to not have programming. So that would without having kind of more information about specifically what you have in mind and what kind of programming we're talking about. Certainly, it's a better idea for programming to exist.
Okay. And then Allie Swan is asking, based on your lobbying and recommendations, what do you think the future of this issue is going to look like?
I really hope that there is a serious commission established to gather data, to establish standards after gathering data. I hope that they decide to do things in order. Like, one of the things that sometimes happens when a problem like this is raised that's very complicated and thorny is that people think that there's an easy solution to it. But even fully funding the current programs would not help because we don't know how well the programs work. We saw wide variation across the state in how drug courts are conducted and how community corrections is conducted. Some of what we saw seemed promising to us, but we don't have numbers on success rates. Some of what we saw seemed obviously counterproductive and abusive, but again, we don't have numbers on success rates there. So unfortunately, I think what we're looking at is that to do this right, there's a multi-step process where first the state needs to gather information about who's in these programs, why they're in the programs, how well they're doing, as in, are people graduating? Are they graduating in a timely fashion? Are they reoffending afterwards? And then it needs to establish some standards and look at funding them completely. But it would be really unfortunate if we skip straight ahead to like saying, okay, all we need to do is pay for these programs and then everything will be fine, because that is not the case.
And I'll also add that in my view, when I am thinking about what the future of these programs might look like legislatively, in terms of what's happening at the State House, I personally feel that a lot of this is going to be contingent on what happens with the prison construction plan, because the orientation of the state government right now, particularly Governor Ivey, has been, we have this insanely unconstitutional prison system, and rather than addressing any of the fundamental issues that have led to such high rates of incarceration and such long sentences in Alabama, the idea is we're going to build even bigger, shiny new prisons that we'll be locked into for 30 years. So as far as we're concerned, Governor Ivey's plan is to just warehouse even more people for decades to come. I think, and we're trying to do anything we can to stop that from happening. If we are successful in stopping prison construction, I think overhauling diversion programs will be a much more urgent legislative priority. So just to like outline that, the contours of that as well, I think the likelihood of legislation passing on this is to some degree connected to what the state of Alabama is doing right now in terms of prison construction.
Alex Sandlin is asking, have you guys noticed?
Oh yeah. So sorry.
Beat me to it.
Yeah, sorry. The question was about have we seen anything promising in juvenile spaces? And the fact is that, quite appropriately, juvenile proceedings are really locked down, and that's as it should be. But it means that it's very hard to conduct any research on how they roll. We have done a lot of research on how school resource officers function, which has been troubling. But in terms of like how diversion programs work or how the juvenile justice system works, it's just a tougher nut to crack because of protected privacy for minors.
I actually have a question. I was wondering what repercussions the state of Alabama face for the prison conditions after the report came out.
That is a very politically charged question. So the investigation into our prisons was initiated under Eric Holder and completed just after Jeff Sessions ended his term as Attorney General. To his credit, Jeff Sessions continued the investigation. He didn't shut it down. I'm sure that it was very difficult for him to see his home state being investigated and exposed in this way. The report that came out in 2019 must have been largely written on his watch. And the subsequent report was written under William Barr. However, it seems fairly unlikely that this Department of Justice, with the very tough on crime law and order orientation of this presidential administration, is going to sue the state. If we see a Biden presidency and a new Department of Justice, it seems more likely that we would see some action against the state in the form of a lawsuit from the Department of Justice. I mean, what's really interesting is like both the 2019 and 2020 reports are absolutely crystal clear that building new prisons will not solve this problem. The problem is culture of corruption among the guards. It is understaffing and lack of programming. So, you'll see the DOC commissioner writing about how, the problem is the buildings. The problem is that they were built to warehouse people, and these wonderful new prisons are going to be much better. But the reality is that that's not what DOJ tells us, and it's a very conservative DOJ that has told us that. So I think that what happens in terms of repercussions for the state really depends on what happens in November.
All right, thank you so much. I am not currently seeing any questions, any new questions in the chat. I'm scrolling back up to make sure I haven't missed any of those. Okay, I think we've answered all the questions thus far. Unless anyone has any new ones they'd like to ask. Okay, well, I would like to thank our presenters, our panelists, for their time and for sharing this presentation and information. Again, thank you so much. And as a wrap-up note for the participants who are not Blackburn members, we invite you to the information tab of Hop In to learn more about the Institute. And then between 4:15 and 4:30, we will have members from the Blackburn community there to talk to you about their experiences and how to get involved. And then for current Blackburn members, we ask you to join us in Stage Tab at 4:15 p.m. for the awarding of the Civil Scholarship. The opening keynote speaker, Dr. Selwyn Vickers, the Senior Vice President of Medicine and the Dean of the University of Alabama School of Medicine, and the pinning of the 2020 Fellows.
Yeah, and thank y'all so much for inviting us to share some of our research. We have been able to share some stuff at the last 2 symposiums, and so the chance to, this is like becoming an annual tradition for us, and I couldn't be happier about it. So yeah, thank y'all so much. This was an unusual symposium, but really good. So we really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean it about email. We love to talk about this stuff, or at least I do. So please be in touch if you have any follow-up questions at all. And thanks for having us.